Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final session of the 2022 Web Archiving Conference. We're so happy you're here with us today. We have a great discussion for you to end the day with, or begin the day if you're in New Zealand and just joined us. Our Q&A session today will focus on three presentations were presented, but we'll have two brief briefings from volunteers with Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online, the SUCHO project, an impromptu organization founded March 1st to attempt to archive as many at-risk Ukrainian cultural heritage websites as possible during the war. Their presentations, which hopefully you had a chance to watch, offered three different perspectives on emergency volunteer-driven web archiving. I'm joined today by SUCHO participants, Quinn Dombrowski, an academic technology specialist at Stanford University in the Library and the Division of Literature, Cultures, and Languages, Anna Kijas, head of Lily Music Library at Tufts University and co-founder of SUCHO, Sebastian Majstorovic, sorry about that, an IT consultant and digital historian who works at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, Ilya Kreymer, creator and lead developer of the Webrecorder projects, Kim Martin, an assistant professor in history and culture and technology studies at the University of Guelph, Erica Peaslee, who is an admin operations coordinator with Centurion Solutions LLC, an emergency and disaster management firm, and serves as the company's cultural heritage subject matter expert. And finally, Dena Strong, senior information design specialist at the University of Urbana-Champaign. Now I'll turn to panel members Quinn and Ilya for brief introduction before we dive into Q&A.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to recap super quickly the last 3 months of our lives and work here. As much as we've managed to fill up your Zoom screen with volunteers here, if you can believe it, this is only a tiny fraction of the over 1,300 volunteers we've had working on SUCHO over the last 3 months. We've been working on archiving URLs that we've gotten in a variety of different ways, both using the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine and the open source Webrecorder tools that hopefully you saw in the video. We've been working on enriching metadata. We've been doing situation monitoring in order to prioritize the work that remains to be done. And there is still so much more work ahead of us, not only with archiving sites, but also thinking about digital repatriation and how to get these materials, back into the hands of the people who, are their stewards in the long term. And I'll turn it over really briefly to Ilya for a few sentences about Webrecorder, and then we're looking forward to this Q&A.
Thanks, Quinn. Yeah, I just wanted to very briefly say that, this was kind of really exciting and kind of a whole lot happened in terms of open source web archiving tools. And essentially, as I mentioned in the video, pretty much almost all of Webrecorder tools have been used by the SUCHO project and have gotten sort of extensive testing and QA sort of at an accelerated pace. That includes the browser extension, as well as the Browserx crawler command line application, and the brand new Browserx Cloud, which is our new essentially user interface open source system for running crawls in the cloud on demand. I covered a little bit of that in the video, and also wanted to say that this kind of ties in with Iipc Tools Portfolio sponsored project for browser-based crawling for all. And so that's also developing that same system, and the Browserx Cloud system will continue to be developed. And SUCHO was really kind of the first accelerated test case for the system, and we hope to continue developing it over the next 2 years.
And truly, when he says for all, literally he means for all, including elementary school students and retirees with limited technical knowledge. It's really been incredible what people have been able to do with Browserx Cloud for this project.
That's so exciting. We're so excited to test it ourselves. So I'm glad to hear your experiences through this project. So let me kick off some questions. I've worked on collaborative event-based emergency crawls and collaborative projects for years and years in various capacities, and also coordinated a lot of volunteers for things like the end of term web archive. So I know it's a huge effort. We never had the amount of volunteers that you all had. So cheers to you all for managing that that on such a quick timeline. And it truly is the next generation model for community-driven web archiving. It's just fantastic to see. So I'm curious what, and maybe Anna, Quinn, Sebastian could start us out here talking about what was the biggest challenges from your various perspectives in the project and working with so many volunteers across so many Slack channels. It looked like you all had a lot to manage and a lot to wrangle in a very quick timeline. So just curious about your perspectives there and how it went.
Yeah, I'll start off by saying that I think one of the challenges was just making sure at first that we were able to get everybody onboarded. And so, within the first few days as we were writing the tutorials and creating the website and getting everyone in Slack, we were also doing training sessions. And so a number of us here were doing training sessions, a number of us here, including, Dena, Kim, and so forth, were working on documentation right from the get-go. And I think that really, it was a challenge, but at the same time, it was really what helped us get to where we are, because all of that foundation that we were creating as we were building the project was an important, part of the development.
Yeah, I'd add to that as with so much digital humanities work, like there's not actually a hack here. Like there's no magic. What it takes is time and energy, and then more time, and then more time, and then more time. And there are things you can do like documentation to sort of help scale it up a little bit. But even the editing process for the documentation, revising it based on people's feedback, that also takes time. And particularly in the first couple of weeks, having Dena, pulling these 12-hour days like in the Slack, so that there was always someone to reply to new people's messages like in a quick time frame, I think was really essential for once people volunteered, to make sure that they had something to do and that there was someone to answer their questions when they came up, and sort of make sure that they were able to stay engaged with it.
And I feel guilty about the fact that I could only do that for 2 weeks. I could not get long-term permission from my employers to just clear the decks for as long as it was needed. I have noticed a distinct difference in the amount of helping I'm able to provide when SUCHO was my life, and that I could clear the deck of literally everything else, versus when I have to manage my life and my job and everything else along with it. I think my nutshell recommendation for anybody who is looking to spin this up in the future would be, start with Google Docs, start with something that everybody can edit, and, tell people, not do this process, but look here for what the latest process is. Because, if there's, a pinned file at the top of every channel, then, when your process changes tomorrow, you don't have to rely on word of mouth to get that out. You have a place to look that anybody can update. Now, whether or not everybody will update is another question, but you at least have a fighting chance that way.
Yeah, and maybe I can add that from my perspective. I mean, you have to imagine we had, I think, 400 volunteers 4 days after we started or something like that, or 700. I don't even remember. You're muted, Quinn.
400 in 1 day.
Yep.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah.
One.
So I mean, we it was like a rocket launching, and then I think what's been, from my perspective, the most challenging, but also the most inspiring is trying to figure out with these many volunteers who can do with which tools, and we have been reassessing which kind of tools people can use, what's their comfort zone, they maybe push their comfort zone. We taught, I don't know how many people for the first time how to use Docker, or the command line for that fact. And that has been down to the amazing work of Quinn and Anna and Dena and everybody who started mentoring each other, but constantly saying, oh, maybe we should keep this tool completely out of the sideline and, just focus on something else, and taking people from where they come from. That's been amazing to watch, but also an incredible challenge.
And were there tools that you all like tried out and then quickly were like, oh no, this is not something the public or the volunteers or maybe a certain group of volunteers would work with, but then not others? Did you kind of divvy it up like that?
It was self-sorting. People would find their own comfort zone and say, this is too hard for me, or this is what I feel comfortable doing. So the people who were comfortable with installing Docker would go to Browsertrix. Once Browsertrix Cloud was out there, the potential user pool just exploded. So anytime that you can take things from step one, you must install, your own virtual machine, to step one, you open a web browser, you dramatically increase the scale of the number of people who will be able to help you out with the thing.
That's
Which
great.
is why Browsertrix Cloud is so awesome.
Yeah. I am curious, like what would be one big thing from all of your perspectives that you might do differently if you were starting another project tomorrow? I think some of that came out a little bit already, but if you were doing this again, what would you change?
I would put the signposts up on day one. I would, we spent a couple of weeks where most of the documentation involved, at least a half an hour, sometimes multi-hour lag between when we thought of the thing and when we needed to get it updated because of the whole GitHub, clone, sync, push, pull, edit, all that things. And so we can't just put the Google Docs straight on the internet, but once you're in our Slack, we trust you enough. So I would have put together those, here are the running points of conversation, track this so that nobody has to read the entire 3 months worth of Slack comments in that channel to know what's going on system sooner, if I had thought of it.
I think oh, you want to go ahead? Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think, learning from this experience, if we were to do this project over again, something that has already occurred as we started working probably within the first few weeks was that within each of our Slack channels, which are generally tied to a specific method or approach, like web scraping, using something other than the web browser tool or the Wayback Machine, or like digitization or Browsertrix, whatever, like having project leads, right? Or like channel leads, so that you have somebody who's sort of going to be monitoring that channel and responsible for guiding people and so forth. We're at that point, but at the very beginning, because we really didn't know what was going to happen and how much time we were going to be spending, using whichever tool, we just didn't have that knowledge in, at the beginning of the project. So we're there now. So I think for any future work like this, it just makes sense. Just like when you're doing a, digital humanities project or any other kind of project with a project management plan, you have people that are going to be leading different areas of development or so forth.
This is more of a prosaic thing, but it took us a number of weeks to realize that DNS data dumps are things that you can just buy and buy for relatively cheaply. And the question of how many websites are there and what are they, was a vexing question, and I mean still is in some sense of trying to filter out which ones are the cultural heritage sites. But literally for $80, you can buy access to a database that has literally a list of all the websites, including not just everything in the Ukrainian domain namespace, but also anything with registration info tied to Ukraine. So once we had that, I mean, suddenly we had more problems, but they were at least different problems than the great vast unknown of what all is out there. I mean, there was some, what struck me, as someone with a background in Slavic area studies, is kind of wild ideas in the early days that some of the groups were doing, including iterating through a dictionary with, the Ukrainian namespace on the end. So apple.com, bear.com, cat.com equivalent, whereas actually being able to just get an authoritative list of the data. That's what I would do on day one now, I think, if I were to start over.
I was this day old that when I this old when I found that out. I didn't know that either. So anyone else have comments on that one? Or
I could add just that I think sorry Ilya. documentation that we've done has been life-changing, right? And so now that it's been done once, we don't have to think about all those starting that and being like, oh, hold on a second, we need documentation for this. I talked a little bit in my talk about the metadata, but we are still going back and redoing metadata. So what I would like is to be taking in metadata when we get those sites, not to have to go back and do that, right? But that's things you live and learn. So I think the documentation is going to help any similar project going forward to kind of a checklist of this is what you should be thinking about.
Actually, that's pretty much what I was going to say. Was I wish that we had kind of more documentation at the very beginning, and the tools were kind of even further along. But that's kind of that's always going to be the desire, to have more documentation and better developed tools, and hopefully for next time that will be the case. So,
Erica, Sebastian, anything there?
I pretty much agree with everybody else. My portion of the project is a lot more, it has to change with what happens in the physical area. So, I mean, I just agree with everybody else.
I honestly wouldn't change anything, because it's a futile exercise in my idea, because there was an emergency, we responded, we developed. It was stunning to see that we saved a single, like not saved, like that we backed up web archived a single site. Hopefully these backups will not be needed. We say that again and again. We hope they are superfluous. But if there's one single site that would have gone offline without our work, I don't really care about what we could have changed from the beginning, to be honest.
Great. Move on. I have another couple of questions before we dive in, and I encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A if you'd like. We'll get to those in a little bit. Quinn,
one more thing before we entirely.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I think that for anybody else who is in a situation where they need to do something like this, the multi-path track to backing up was really, really significant. So being able to have both the Internet Archive for snapshots across time and Browsertrix Cloud for deep dive on one particular day, they solved different problems for different reasons at different resolutions, and we needed them both.
Great. I had a question, Quinn, I love the graph you had in the beginning of your presentation about the ramping up and the longer term thinking around projects like this. And I know that institutions like my own tend to work very slowly. We have a permissions process, and we have to contact the lawyers, and we have to do all the things to get the crawl set up. So we're slow moving in terms of like, spontaneous events. We don't do those terribly well. But I like the idea of like the institutions that could be responsible more long-term for the care of these things. And curious if you had other thoughts about how organizations like my own might support efforts, or how we could work together when events like this happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think just structurally there's a gap between like the way they operate, which is a good thing and like important for the long-term sustainability part. And I wouldn't want to propose, changing that fundamentally to be able to support that work. And I think in this case, Stanford University has been, really an amazing, organization in terms of how they've supported the project, where, I mean, they are now in some of these longer term conversations, but especially for the first 2 months of the project, the message I got from all the leadership in the library and in my department was, there's nothing we can ask you to do that's more important than this. So you go do this. Mm-hmm. And the same was the case for a lot of my colleagues in the library. Ed Summers, Laura Werbel, and many others put in a lot of time on SUCHO, like at work, and that was not a problem. Some things took a little bit longer as a result, but I think everyone was on the same page that like this is important, like this is part of our mission as we think about it in the big picture. It's okay for you to do that as part of your job. So giving, to the extent possible, giving people that freedom and flexibility to sort of act on behalf of the institution, not sort of like, as a representative of the institution exactly, but like sort of with the kind of kind of emotional support backing of the institution, on these things, kind of in their capacity as individuals, with all of the flexibility that affords, while also thinking about the longer term.
I plus one in the field of my management was not. I mean, my particular boss said, take the time you need, do what you need to do. Once it hit the HR level, they were like, well, nope, this has nothing to do with your daily job, so you can only spend as much time as you have vacation time to put on it. If institutions would be able to say, I free you of what your daily grind would otherwise be, and I allocate you to this project, without having to soak your vacation and sick leave time. That would be the biggest and fastest thing I can think of that an institution can do to support this.
Yeah, a lot of collaborative web archiving projects are based on like the volunteer efforts of people who might already be doing web archiving, but have to carve out additional time to do extra work or nominations for projects. So good to hear that and have that reinforced too. So, there's so many good aspects of this project I want to get into. I have all sorts of questions, but I did have a kind of a specific questions for Ilya about the triage process, because you talked a little bit about the various tools and the comfort levels that people had, and it sounded like there was a bit of a manual process that did happen. If one tool wasn't working well, you moved it over to a different tool. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that was? It other more experienced web archiving folks that were making those decisions or doing the more focused efforts?
Actually, I think I wasn't personally involved in the triage process. I think someone else could probably answer that better. But things were organized in such a way that that there was a separate tab for essentially for using the archive web page extension, the manual web recorder tab, as it was called. I think it was understood that things that are too difficult to crawl or that mostly involve, for example, museum and sort of building walkthroughs and other complex sites would get sorted into that tab. But I think perhaps someone else can answer better about how that process actually happened.
I mean, I have a really vivid example that is maybe really important in the web archiving community, because when I started, using Webrecorder on my own on the first night before I posted the form to collect links and just tried a few websites, I think the fourth website or so that I tried was a institutional repository, so a DSpace to name names, and it failed immediately because of some link structure that was just going in loops and loops and loops. And so even before SUCHO was a thing, it already was clear web archiving has hit its limits. And I said, well, skip and try something else. And I think there's a lot of other examples, like Ilya just mentioned the virtual 3D tours, but I mean, that institutional repositories cannot be web archived easily is a big problem.
Yeah, and I'll just say with links, so we have a workflow, and actually I'm working with one of our volunteers to kind of expand the workflow as a visual, so that we can post that on the web soon. But we leave the troubleshooting up to our volunteers who are working with the specific tools, right? So when we get links, we have a group of volunteers that goes through and reviews them and does things like malware checks and makes sure there aren't duplicates and so forth. And then it gets put into our buckets of browser tricks and Internet Archive. And those folks then go through their process and see, okay, can we crawl it with these tools? And if not, where should we put it? So whether it goes to manual web recorder or perhaps it needs to be scraped using Python code, right? So some of that troubleshooting actually occurs once people have their hands on the URL and can see what is it that they're trying to crawl or archive.
I think there should talk about there's a level of autonomy and collaboration in all of this.
Do we lose our audio?
I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we might need to, you might turn off your video for a second. The audio was a little choppy there.
So what I was saying is that Quinn texted me one night. She said, I saw you're online. Can you try to run through this? But sorry, I'm gonna have to carry on.
We can come back to that comment. We'll come back to that because I have another question for you too. So let me dive into a few of the questions here in the chat, and then I can come back. Oh, sorry, there's a little noise in the background. We're going to start with the most upvoted question. What can be done to proliferate more SUCHO-like efforts for other places in crisis? For example, Sri Lanka is going through serious humanitarian and political crises, but we do not see such movements to preserve their cultural heritage.
And one of the things that we've been trying to the fore out of this is that ideally there shouldn't be any more SUCHOs. Like this is a terrible way to go about doing things, and not actually the way that anyone would choose to, given other options. Similarly, we kick ourselves for not having done more in January, when a lot of people saw the writing on the wall in Ukraine, but until it was a full-blown crisis, and already in a state where it was already quite difficult to work with people on the ground with these things. We didn't swing into action. And what we're advocating for is thinking about how we can do more proactive web archiving. Not that we can be constantly proactively web archiving everything everywhere, but how can we set up perhaps the facilitation of UNESCO, some kind of mutual network, preemptively make Web Archiving Week an international celebration where everyone's in touch with their partners. Everyone makes sure that copies of some of the most significant cultural heritage things from everywhere in the world is being covered by this network in a way that takes advantage of being able to more easily communicate with people before it's a full out war situation. So that's really ideally how we'd like to see it done, realizing that this is going to be a long-term project to be able to get anywhere with that, and it's not going to solve the next crisis or two crises down the line, but perhaps after that. It's at the same time, these projects also to be able to do them reasonably successfully and quickly, they really depend on some degree of linguistic knowledge and cultural knowledge and regional expertise. And we've been able to many, if probably most of our volunteers don't read any Slavic languages or Cyrillic. There are people within the group reasonably well distributed who have that linguistic and cultural background. We've had the benefit of working with many subject area librarians, for instance, who've had databases and resource guides and know where to look and know where to go. And I think this ties into another question about Eurocentric collecting areas getting more attention. Partly just because there's easier access to expertise through institutional channels. If you think about it, some of the expertise that we've drawn upon with SUCHO, is kind of like a long tail side effect of Cold War funding for, Slavic, area studies within the US, within Canada, and within Western Europe. I think there's a lot of things that we can do to shift the model, especially with, better tools that have a lower barrier to entry, to be able to draw upon kind of the expertise within immigrant communities, for instance, where there is that same degree of linguistic and cultural knowledge, but being able to connect that with sort of the tools and use that to build up a broader community of people who want to be able to contribute to these sorts of emergency efforts.
I also wanted to add to this, because I also have been thinking about this and kind of to add to what Quinn was saying, that certainly this isn't the first, unfortunately, situation where an emergency archiving effort is needed, and it won't be the last, and we need to be prepared for that. I think, as Quinn mentioned, making the tools easier to use with every iteration, and making them having better documentation and sort of lowering the barrier to entry, and so that members from different communities can take on such archiving efforts. I mean, really, I think it takes sort of a core group of organizers, as we have here, to start something like this, and hopefully with better documentation and better tools, we'll make the tools and the documentation more accessible, so that folks from other communities can take on such an effort, or reach out to others who can help them. So yeah, I think it's about lowering the barriers to entry for a community-based web archiving, and we're slowly making progress on that.
Kind of a related, or maybe a tie-on question from Megan Lyon on my team. Any ideas on how the Iipc can facilitate that network of sister city web archive preservation vision that Quinn described in the recording to avoid the Molotov cocktail scenario? Like what can we do to help support this?
Well, I think there's also some degree of technical experimentation that can be done. So right now, like on my side, with a bunch of German volunteers who run the German National Data Research Infrastructure, we're trying to test some technologies that might be able to bring institutions together to do mutual web archiving. For example, one of the first problems is, where do you store this stuff? You know, if you have to do something mutually, like, I mean, one of my biggest challenges was constantly rolling over more and more terabytes to new cloud storage. You know, it's over 50 terabytes now. But I mean, Quinn and Anna have seen me, you know, like, you know, trying like, oh God, where do we put this now? You can't just put those on a shelf. And if you try to do something together and you do a mutual kind of network, you would also need, for example, I'm starting on the European level, but it would be nice to have a global, you know, web archiving backup space where these, you know, archives can go. Obviously, Internet Archive is always the first choice, and I know they're working on, you know, ingesting WAC files, for example, as well. But then there's a bunch of other ideas that you can test. For example, you know, like how can we set up browser tricks, you know, distributedly, so that, like, let's say there would be a register. Quinn has mentioned it. You know, like a UNESCO kind of, you know, World Digital Memory Register. And how can we then say, you know, okay, you know, this library takes these part of this register, you know, and, you know, there's a lot of libraries, I guess, national libraries that are legal deposits that are already doing a web archiving, but can they facilitate then maybe ways that archives, libraries, and so on can do that for each other? So it's also a technological challenge, and we're trying to explore that as the lesson comes from SUCHO. But it's you know, it's new developments, I think.
Yeah, and I noticed there was a question that already got answered in the chat about permissions and whether or not you asked. And I know that's a big barrier for like the Library of Congress and some of the other Iipc members for taking in collections that were collected by other people, because we have such a rigid permissions process, or the legal deposit laws might not cover content that wasn't archived by the organization that was collecting them. So it does present an interesting challenge with the, you know, the the differences between our organizations too. Anyone else have a comment on that, or we can move on? Erica, I wanted to get to your, I hope your audio is working. I thought the idea of the priority levels were really interesting in the information security piece of this, and the monitoring that you were doing. I think that's something that we don't think about much, and I haven't heard that come up at Iipc meetings or discussions before, that way of approaching selection, really, or how to identify content that might be at risk. So anything to add on that, or advice you might give us for those of us who might be doing collecting in these areas?
I just want to do one quick mic check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I apologize. I have no clue what's going on. So, I mean, I think on our documentation early on, we kind of came up with this motto: if you think it's sensitive, treat it as though it is, because especially in a highly distributed network of people worldwide, you ultimately don't always know each other very well. So you may not know who they're talking to when they go out for coffee or whatnot. And I think part of that, you know, I have a background in curation and working in archives, but working in emergency management and with combat veterans, you kind of get this sense of, I guess it's called little paranoia, but that leads into the information security. And, you know, especially when we're dealing with situations on the ground, we might be protecting the digital part, but we're also helping those who may be physically at risk, and collections physically at risk of being damaged. And so it leads back into our responsibility to our colleagues, and just protecting it and very distributed. We're not risking them somehow being more by what we're doing. And so I really just basic things it's nothing entirely special or entirely technical that one can do in any library, any kind of organization to extend those same principles to other projects. So.
Great, thank you. Let's jump back to the Q&A here. Thinking of the work Webrecorder is doing with new design Congress around privacy and threat modeling, are there particular risks associated with crowdsourcing citizen web crawling?
That's a great question. I think the report from New Design Congress that we'll have actually will be ready, I believe next week, around their what their research shows. I think I guess my thought on it is that yes, there's always a risk. I think the particular focus here, I think, has been specifically on public cultural sites, and so that kind of eliminates some of the risk in a way, because there's a very specific narrow focus. It's not just there's an aspect of choosing which sites will be archived. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. We're hoping to address that hopefully in the future. That there are some things such as, for example, signing the WAXI files that could help with that. But yes, there is kind of a balance of having as many people involved in an emergency situation such as this, and being able to necessarily verify everyone that's involved. But I think overall, the folks that were on the Slack were pretty much part of the community, and so there was less risk of bad actors being involved than perhaps in other cases.
Great. Let's see how's our time. There was somebody that hasn't watched the recorded talk yet, but were there any institutions outside of the Ukraine with the topic of Ukrainian heritage as a part of their existing collection development policies? And this kind of gets at also like how you all came together, or like were you all collecting in this area? Were a number of the people selecting content collecting already in this area, interested in this topic, building collections already, or just it was the thing to do?
We're a bunch of random people who met on the internet and thought it was a good idea. Anna, you should tell the origin story here.
Sure. Yeah, well, some of us do know each other through our digital humanities networks, but yeah, like I, was whatever, 3,000 miles away from Sebastian, I don't know. And we were having, I think, similar ideas about, how we could potentially web archive Ukrainian cultural heritage. Mine was a little bit more focused on music. I'm a music librarian, and I was actually planning for a music conference that week. And so I was like, hey, we're all going to have, music librarians in the audience. We're doing a virtual conference. Let's do a workshop. I'll get together with a group and do some data rescue focusing on music collections. And so from there, started tweeting about it and got interest from a lot of different people, and then connected with Sebastian, started talking with Quinn and so forth. And Sebastian was already thinking about doing a much larger approach for digitized or online cultural heritage. And so that's kind of where we started.
And it reminds me of the very early day. I've been around a long time in web archiving, and very early on, I would pick up the phone when something happened, like Hurricane Katrina or something, and be like, Internet Archive, are you crawling? Are you crawling? Do you want to crawl? Should we start crawling? Is anybody crawling? It was like the phone tree of web archiving, but on email.
Yeah, and I'll add too, actually, like I did ping a few people from different communities in data rescue, and like environmental data rescue, government data rescue, and some of my other, colleagues in digital humanities to see if anybody was starting to do crawls on Ukrainian cultural heritage. And they were like, no, we don't know of anything. And I was like, all right, let's go.
Well, and we have an East European Government Ministries web archive, and our curator for that collection had a lot that we were already crawling in this area, but she was watching what you all were doing, but also adding to her collection. We have a 1-year embargo, so it's not yet publicly accessible, which she added more recently, but it was interesting to see, like, it was going around our circles too, like, make sure you are watching what's going on over there. So exciting to hear those first stories about how it came about. So how are we doing on time? We have a few more minutes. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Let me see if I had anything else. I did want to add. Go ahead, Sebastian. Go ahead.
No, because I actually have a counter example. So, okay, first of all, I have to say, if Anna hadn't tweeted, nothing would have happened, right? She had the idea. That's really, really important. It was a really random, coming together, but because I had talked to Ilya before for my day job, because I had tried Webrecorder to try to archive digital humanities, like projects that have to be switched off. That happens as well. So then we came together, but without Anna's tweet, nothing would have happened, because you have to have the idea to start with. And that's also something about SUCHO that is really important. I think somebody needs to start. That's a big lesson. But actually, I have a counterexample. So one of our volunteers is from the Bavarian State Library, and she has been very, 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 very active from the beginning. And she is the head of the Eastern European section of the Bavarian State Library, and they have a huge collection of all kinds of materials. And they actually have they have thought about web archiving even a few years ago, tried web archiving, and their lawyers said, no, we can't do it. Germany. But so they then said, okay, let's put all our power to SUCHO, and let's put the people, let's put our people on it. So that's maybe something that's interesting. So there were institutions who then also sent links to a link list. All these links that came from everywhere around the world. I don't know who the people actually are. Probably they have researched these collections and they care about them. That was a key, So yeah.
You're getting a huge round of applause from the audience for this entire project. So I think we have time for one other question, although we didn't get to the metadata question that I had, but well, I'll ask that later. But we had a question about, I know that this collection is being made in trust for Ukraine, but are there plans to allow research otherwise?
I mean, I wouldn't rule out that possibility, but I feel like that's not where we're at right now. We do have a sub project that is more geared towards research. We have our meme team sub project where we're documenting memes across different languages, different media sources, along with metadata, transcription, and things like that. And that sub effort is from the beginning more designed for with sort of future researchers and future historians in mind. But I mean, really, it's too soon. Like we don't want to make promises on behalf of this material that we're capturing it in order to give it back, or at least check in with the people who created it and see what they want done with it. And if they want that to be available in a sort of research oriented archive, like absolutely we can do that. If they want us to delete it, we're also just as happy to do that too. So I think it's just too early to say on that, but if you're into memes, we'll have some good stuff for you.
That's awesome. Yeah, there was a, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
You had asked a backstage question that I would like to speak in,
sure.
and that is the, how did, I had a slide with like, here's the tools that we're using, and you asked, how did we choose the tools? We didn't choose the tools. People brought their expertise with them when they came to the project. They said, hey, this is a tool that I found useful for X. Like that was even happening in the Slack literally today. Because when you're working at this speed, you don't have time for everybody to learn a brand new tool. You use the tools that are already familiar, and then you help build everybody's expertise with the assistance of a mentor, rather than, okay, let's try this entirely new system entirely from scratch with nobody actually knowing what's going on.
That's great. That's amazing. And there's just so many directions that could have gone to, but you were in good hands with Ilya and all of his suite of tools that are out there. So congrats to you all. I think we are about out of time. So thank you all. This has been really fantastic. And for those who might be interested in following up with questions, we'll have a Slack channel in the conference Slack that will be open a little bit longer than the conference. So please feel free to ask questions there. We really appreciate your time today. And thank you all for joining us.